Once upon a time, there lived a woman named Nneka. Nneka lived in the heart of a big city. Her house sat in the middle of a busy neighborhood, where the streets were busy, buzzing with life. The city was full of noise, cars honking, market women calling out their princes, children playing in the streets. But Nneka's voice was the loudest of all of them. Nneka had a special talent. She knew everything that was happening in the city. If a baby was born, Nneka knew. If someone lost their job, Nneka was the first to hear about it. And she didn't just keep the news to herself. No, she loved to talk. She would stand by her front door or at the market and shared the latest gossip with anyone who cared to listen. You won't believe what happens to Madam Bisi's son, Nneka would whisper, her eyes wide with excitement. Her words flew like birds, reaching every corner of the neighborhood, spreading stories that sometimes made people laugh, but other times caused problems. People called her the Queen of Gossip. And though some loved her stories, others were afraid of what she might say about them next. One day, Nneka heard something about her neighbor Mr. Ade that made her sit up straight. She had overheard a conversation about how Mr. Ade was involved in something suspicious. Without waiting to find out the full truth, she rushed to tell everyone. Before long, the whole neighborhood was talking about Mr. Ade. They whispered behind his back, stared at him when he walked by, and some even stopped to talk to him. Mr. Ade didn't know why people were treating him so badly, but Nneka kept spreading the story, laughing at the chaos she had started. But what Nneka did not realize was that her words were tearing apart Mr. Ade's life. His business started to suffer, and even his family began to doubt him. But Nneka didn't care. She loved the attention her gossip brought her. The city had never been more divided. One afternoon, Nneka ran to Mama Chinyere, the oldest woman in the neighborhood. Mama Chinyere had lived through many things and was known for her wisdom. She called Nneka over and said, "My dear, do you know that words are like feathers? Once you let them go, you can never gather them all back." Nneka laughed. "Mama, what do you mean? It's just talk. People will forget." But Mama Chinyere shook her head. "Words have power, Nneka. Be careful or you will learn this the hard way." Nneka didn't take the warning seriously. To her, it was just an old woman's story. But as she walked away, a small part of her couldn't shake the feeling that Mama Chinyere might be right. As days went by, the effect of Nneka's gossip began to grow like seed planted in the hearts of their neighbor. Small disagreements turned into big arguments, and friendships that had lasted for years crumbled overnight. People began to question each other's action, and suspicion replaced trust. Nneka noticed that the street no longer felt as friendly. Neighbors who used to greet each other with smiles now passed in silence, their faces tense with hidden anger. Even at the market, people who once laughed and shared stories now stood on opposite sides, avoiding eye contact. Nneka's stories were behind much of the conflict, but she didn't see it that way. She told herself that she was just sharing what everyone wanted to hear. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. Everywhere she went, she could feel the weight of her words pressing down on her, though she wasn't ready to admit it. One afternoon, while passing by Mr. Ade's house, Nneka noticed his wife sitting on the porch, her face buried in her hands. The once lively home was now quiet, and the laughter of Mr. Ade's children no longer echoed from the yard. Nneka felt a pang of guilt, but she quickly shook it off, convincing herself that she hadn't done anything wrong. That night, Nneka had a strange and unsettling dream. In her dream, she stood in the middle of the neighborhood, holding a large bag of feathers. One by one, she took the feathers and tossed them into the air. At first, the feathers floated gently around her, light and harmless, but soon the wind picked up and the feathers were carried away far beyond her reach. Nneka ran after the feathers, trying to catch them, but no matter how hard she tried, they slipped through her hands and disappeared into the distance. She called out for help, but no one came. The streets were empty and she was all alone, surrounded by swelling feathers that she could never gather again. When she woke up, her heart was racing. The dream felt so real, as if it was trying to tell her something, but Nneka was stubborn. She pushed the dream to the back of her mind, refusing to believe that it had any meaning. As Nneka's gossip continued to spread, the effects began to creep into her own home. Her husband, Emeka, was growing more distant with each passing day. He no longer laughed with her or listened to her stories like he used to. Instead, he would come home from work, eat his dinner in silence, and go to bed early, leaving Nneka alone with her thoughts. Their children, once full of energy and laughter, had also changed. They had grown quiet and kept to themselves, avoiding conversation with their mother. Nneka couldn't understand why their house was so quiet and heavy, but deep down, she knew it had something to do with her endless gossiping. One evening, Emeka finally spoke up. "Nneka, I am tired," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Every day, all I hear from you are stories about other people's life. You spend so much time talking about them that you have forgotten about us." His words stung. Nneka wanted to argue, but she couldn't find the right words. For the first time, she realized that gossip wasn't just affecting her neighbors. It was also tearing apart her own family. The turning point came when Mr. Ade, who had been the target of Nneka's worst gossip, could no longer stay silent. He stormed down the street and stopped right in front of Nneka's house, his face filled with anger. "Nneka," he shouted, loud enough for the whole neighbors to hear, "you have destroyed my name with your lies. My business is falling. My friends have abandoned me, and even my own family doesn't trust me anymore, all because of your careless words." Nneka stepped out of her house, startled by the confrontation. Neighbors began to gather, curious to see what would happen. Mr. Day's voice was shaking with emotion. "You have never even bothered to find out the truth. How could you spread such lies?" Nneka, always proud and defensive, folded her arms and said, "I'm only sharing what I heard though. It's not my fault though, if people believed it." But the crowd didn't side her this time. Murmurs spread through the group, and Nneka could feel the tide turning against her. For the first time, she was on the receiving end of the whispers, and it made her feel small and powerless. Mr. Ade shook his head. "One day, Nneka, you will understand the damage you have caused, but then it might be too late." With that, he walked away, leaving Nneka standing alone, the weight of her actions pressing down on her shoulders. As the days passed, Nneka found herself increasingly isolated. The very people who used to crowd around her, eager to hear the latest gossip, now avoided her. She could see them whispering to each other as she passed by, but no one included her in their conversations anymore. At the market, where she once held court as the queen of gossip, Nneka now walked alone. Her stories, which was once made her the center of attention, had become the reason people turned away from her. She tried to pretend it didn't bother her, but the loneliness was growing harder to ignore. Even in her home, Nneka felt like a stranger. Emeka barely spoke to her, and the children seemed to avoid her more each day. The silence in her home, once filled with laughter and chatter, was deafening. It was only now, as her words grew smaller and quieter, that Nneka began to understand the true weight of her words. She had built her life on gossip, and now it was falling apart around her. One morning, as Nneka sat on her front porch, lost in thought, a stranger appeared in the neighborhood. He was a tall, quiet man, dressed in simple clothes, and he moved through the streets with a calm and peaceful air. No one knew where he had come from, but his presence seemed to bring a sense of calm to the city. The stranger noticed Nneka sitting alone and approached her. "You look troubled," he said gently. Nneka, who had never been one to open up to strangers, surprised herself by telling him about the mess she had created with her gossip. The stranger listened quietly, nodding as she spoke. When she finished, he looked at her with kind eyes and said, "Let me tell you a story. There was once a village that was destroyed by the careless words of one person. The people in the village stopped trusting each other, and soon the village was no more. The people who started it all didn't realize the harm they had caused until it was too late." Nneka felt a chill run down her spine. The stranger's story sounded too familiar, like he was talking about her own life, but she couldn't respond. The stranger asked, "How will you fix what you have broken?" And with that, he walked away, leaving Nneka with a question she didn't know how to answer. After the stranger's visit, Nneka couldn't stop thinking about his question. How will you fix what you have broken? She knew she had caused damage with her gossip, but she didn't know where to begin. Her thoughts kept returning to Mama Chinyere's warning about words being like feathers in the wind. Determined to understand, Nneka visited Mama Chinyere's small house on the edge of the neighborhood. When Mama Chinyere saw her, she smiled knowingly. "You have come because of the words you have spread, haven't you?" Nneka nodded, her voice low. "Mama, I didn't mean to cause so much harm. I just couldn't stop myself from talking. Now, I don't know how to fix it." Mama Chinyere listened quietly before standing up and handing Nneka a small bag filled with feathers. "Take these feathers," she said, "and place one in front of every house in the neighborhood. Don't miss a single house, though. Once you are done with that, come back to me." Confused but eager to show she could still make things right, Nneka took the bag and set off. It took her all afternoon to walk through the neighborhood, carefully placing a single feather in front of every door. Some neighbors watched her from their windows, curious but silent. Others ignored her completely. When she finished, she returned to Mama Chinyere's house, feeling proud of her efforts. The next morning, Nneka returned to Mama Chinyere, expecting a word of praise. But instead, Mama Chinyere gave her a new task. "Now," she said, "I want you to go back and collect all the feathers you have placed yesterday. Gather them all and bring them back to me." Nneka blinked in surprise. "But Mama, the wind have already blown them away. Some of those feathers must be miles away by now. How am I supposed to find them?" Mama Chinyere's eyes were gentle but firm. "Exactly, Nneka. Just as you cannot gather those flies once they have been scattered, you cannot take back the words you have spread. They have traveled far beyond your control, and the harm they have caused cannot simply be undone." Nneka stood frozen as the truth of Mama Chidi's lesson sank in. Her words, just like the feathers, had been carried by the wind, reaching places she could never have predicted. And just like those feathers, she could never fully retrieve them. With a heavy heart, Nneka walked home, replaying Mama Chidi's words over and over in her mind. For the first time, she truly understood the impact of her gossip. She saw how her careless stories had turned neighbors against each other, ruined friendship, and sown destruct throughout the community. As she walked through the streets, she noticed the damage she had caused more clearly than ever before. She saw Madam Bisi walking alone without the company of her usual friends. She passed Mr. Ade's shop, which now had fewer customers than it once did. Everywhere she looked, there were signs of the hurt she had caused, and it weighed heavily on her. Nneka felt ashamed. She had always thought gossip was harmless fun, but now she realized how deep words could wound. The feathers, once light and playful, now felt like stones pressing down on her heart. Determined to make amends, Nneka knew she had to apologize to the people she had wronged. But where to start? She decided to begin with Mr. Ade, the man she had hurt the most with her reckless words. The next morning, Nneka stood in front of Mr. Ade's house, feeling nervous. She knocked on the door, and when Mr. Ade opened it, his face was a mixture of surprise and anger. "Nneka, what do you want?" he asked, his voice cold. "I've come to apologize," she said softly. "I know I've hurt you and your family with my gossip, and I can never take back what I've done, but I am truly sorry." Mr. Ade looked at her for a long moment before sighing. "You don't know how much damage your words have caused. My business has suffered, my family has suffered, and all because of a lie you just spread." Nneka's heart sank. "I know. I am trying to fix it. I don't expect forgiveness right away, but I want you to know that I am sorry, and I will do whatever I can to make things right." Mr. Ade nodded slowly, still hurt but touched by her sincerity. "It will take time, Nneka, but it's a start." From there, Nneka went door to door, apologizing to everyone she had wronged. Some neighbors forgave her right away, understanding that people make mistakes, but others were not so quick to forgive. They slammed their doors in her face or refused to speak to her at all. Nneka accepted their anger, knowing that forgiveness was something she would have to earn over time. As Nneka continued her journey of seeking forgiveness, something remarkable began to happen in the city. The more she apologized and tried to make amends, the more others in the community started to open up and forgive one another. Neighbors who had stopped speaking because of Nneka's gossip slowly began to rebuild their relationship. Mr. Ade's business began to recover as people realized the truth and returned to support him. Mr. Bisi's friends started visiting her again, and laughter slowly returned to the streets that had once been filled with suspicion. Nneka's transformation became an inspiration for others. People began to think twice before spreading rumors or speaking ill of their neighbors. They saw the damage that careless words could cause and started to choose their words more carefully. Though the community was healing, Nneka knew that it would take a long time to fully repair the relationships she had damaged, but she was committed to the process, no matter how long it took. Months passed, and the city slowly became a more peaceful place. Nneka was no longer the queen of gossip. Instead, she had earned a new reputation, the woman who had learned the true power of words. She still enjoyed talking to her neighbors, but now her conversations were filled with kindness and encouragement rather than gossips and rumors. She used her words to build people up, not tear them down. One day, as Nneka walked through the city, she saw a group of children playing in the street. They were laughing and sharing stories, carefree and happy. Nneka smiled to herself, knowing that her words had once sown division, but now they were helping to bring the community back together. From then on, whenever anyone in the neighborhood started to gossip, someone would remind them of Nneka's story, the story of a woman who tried to gather feather in the wind And with that simple reminder, people would think twice before letting careless words slip from their mouths. The lesson of the feathers had spread far and wide, and it became a part of the community's history, a reminder of the power that words hold. And Nneka, now wiser and more careful with her speech, had found her place in the heart of the city, a place where her words were used to unite, not destroy.